An authentic American hero. According to the Columbus Dispatch, John Glenn died this afternoon surrounded by his family at the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center in Columbus. He had spent most of his time with his beloved wife, Annie, and she was there when he passed. A true, authentic American hero. You heard in Nancy Cordes' obituary of John Glenn those famous words, "Godspeed, John Glenn." Those were uttered by Scott Carpenter. He was the second astronaut, second American to orbit the Earth. That was the send-off to John Glenn on February 20th, 1962, when he became the first American to orbit the Earth. But even before he became part of that Mercury program, he was a respected American hero, having flown multiple combat missions in World War II. For more on John Glenn's life, we turn to CBS News space consultant Bill Harwood, who comes to us via the telephone. Bill, this is an incredibly sad day for the country, for aviation, for NASA, but for the world, because he was a true pioneer when it came to aviation, probably only seconded to the Wright brothers.
You know, we might even have to go past that. I'm not sure. You know, his legacy is just, you know, it's unmatched, and I'm not sure we'll ever see anything like it in our lifetimes. You know, we bandy the word hero about quite a bit these days, various contexts, but John Glenn truly was a hero by any standard definition of the word. I mean, his career is just, like I said, it's unmatched. When you look at his space achievements, his military accomplishments, and, of course, 25 years as a U.S. Senator, I think it'll be a long time before we see his like again.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick reading of his awards, his medals. Awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross on 6 occasions. He holds the Air Medal with 18 clusters for his service during World War II in Korea. He also holds the Navy Unit Commendation for Service in Korea, the Marine Corps Astronaut Medal, the NASA Distinguished Service Medal, the Congressional Space Medal of Honor. I mean, there are just there probably were not enough honors to bestow upon John Glenn. And the mission, that very first Mercury mission, Friendship 7, just give us a sense of how that allowed NASA to proceed from that, how momentous it was launching Mercury 7. Friendship 7.
Yeah, you have to keep it in the context of the times. You know, I mean, this was at the moment when the Russians had beat us, putting the first satellite in space. They had put the first cosmonaut in space a year before, Yuri Gagarin, and of course, you know, the U.S. had taken it on the chin. You know, they thought that the Soviet Union was really winning this battle on the high frontier. And John Glenn's flight to become the first American in orbit really restored the nation's confidence that it could, in fact, meet this Russian threat, and eventually would, of course, as we all know, win the race to the moon. But John Glenn's flight, it's hard to imagine now the pressure that was on NASA for that mission, the risk that John Glenn took, and the unbelievable adulation the country showered upon him after he got back. It was just an amazing event. I remember from my childhood. But certainly in the context of the times, there's been very few missions like it.
Yeah, Bill, according to NASA, that mission, there were 3 objectives: to place a piloted spacecraft into orbital flight around the Earth, to observe human performance in those conditions, and to recover the human and spacecraft safely. And all of those things, as you pointed out, ultimately put us on the path to actually putting a man on the moon in 1969.
Well, that's right. You know, and when you look at that Friendship 7 flight, it had some very, very scary moments. It was not like today where we look at human space flight and think it's fairly routine. You know, when he was up there in orbit, they discovered that his heat shield, there was a sensor that indicated the heat shield, which would protect the spacecraft from the fatal heat of reentry, might have been loose. They weren't sure, so they changed their procedures a little bit. And when he entered the atmosphere, no one was really sure if he was going to come out the other side alive. Really a lot of tension on that flight. And, of course, we all know he did come out and went on to everything else. But that was a really scary flight and a really important first step in America's race to the moon.
Bill, let me just now, for our viewers, read a statement from Governor John Kasich of Ohio. He says, "John Glenn is and always will be Ohio's ultimate hometown hero, and his passing today is an occasion for all of us to grieve. As we bow our heads and share our grief with his beloved wife, Annie, we must also turn to the skies to salute his remarkable journeys and his long years of service to our state and nation. Though he soared deep into space and to the heights of Capitol Hill, his heart never strayed from his steadfast Ohio roots. Godspeed, John Glenn, Governor John Kasich, ending with, I think, those words that we will hear many times today and into the days ahead. Bill, the words of Scott Carpenter, the second American into space. Godspeed, John Glenn. Give us a sense also, as you pointed out, Bill, clearly the Soviets, having launched the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961, the kind of pressure that the United States was under and how important it was for the nation and for the country not only to see John Glenn ultimately get up into space, but the entire Mercury program.
Oh, you can't overstate it. You know, I mean, this was the step that basically proved we had the basic technology to put humans in space and keep them alive, bring them back. Of course, Mercury was, once that was accomplished, the Mercury was followed by the Gemini program, where these two-person spacecraft perfected the rendezvous techniques that ultimately were used in the Apollo programs to the moon.
From the cosmos to
But there's nothing really that can ever duplicate those initial Mercury flights. Really high-risk endeavors, and they're what really got us on the road to space.
And, you know, it's interesting, for those people who may have seen The Right Stuff and read the book by Tom Wolfe, all of these men that were selected to be the Mercury astronauts, there they are, all American heroes. But there was something special about that Marine Corps officer, John Glenn. What was it about him that seemed to shine? Was it his good looks? You know, the fact that he exemplified, I think, not just for the Marine Corps, but for all servicemen and women, the attitude of service to the country. What was it about John Glenn?
It was all of the above, lad. I mean, it really was. He married his childhood sweetheart. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps after World War II, flew all those combat missions, was an experienced test pilot. He was a rock-solid, not flamboyant at all, a person, I think, that really appealed to the core American values. You know, when they announced that they were getting ready to send a human into space, they didn't announce who it would be, and they announced three. Gus Grissom, Alan Shepard, and John Glenn. They didn't tell who it would be, and I think everybody thought it would be John Glenn. And, of course, as we know now, Shepard made the first flight, Glenn the second, but in the end, Glenn won the biggest prize of all by becoming the first American to orbit the Earth and directly answer the Soviets' accomplishment with Yuri Gagarin. So I think it was all of those things. But he really personified those core American values of, you know, family, religious faith, and love of country. And John Glenn, like I said, that was his life, almost the definition of it.
And Bill, you know, as we look back on this incredible career, I mean, it was all the more remarkable when in his final year as a United States Senator in 1998, he was reborn as an astronaut. At 77, he orbited the Earth again with 6 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery, once again sort of throwing his body into something that only very few people on this entire planet have ever experienced, but certainly not at 77. Describe what that was like.
Well, it's hard to describe. You know, I mean, a lot of people thought it would be impossible for this to ever happen, but the administrator at the time, Dan Golden, ultimately was convinced that it was the right thing to do. You know, there was some criticism. A lot of folks out there in the community, retired astronauts, said that, you know, one person, you know, a data point of one isn't really going to tell you a lot about the effects of space flight on aging. But John Glenn was a very convincing case. He was in great physical shape. He had a very detailed list of experiments to carry out in space, and in the end, he got approval to do it, and as you said, became the oldest man to ever fly in space. It was a remarkable achievement. I wrote in a story about him once that he was quietly relentless in his drive to win that space flight. And, of course, Dan Golden, the administrator, went along with it, and as they say, the rest is history. It was an amazing achievement.
I want to share with our viewers that NASA has just tweeted, "We are saddened by the loss of Senator John Glenn, the first American to orbit Earth, a true American hero. Godspeed, John Glenn." Ad Astra. What is Ad Astra for those who may not know, Bill?
I'm sorry, I couldn't catch that. I was on the telephone, Glenn. I'm getting calls, as you might imagine.
I'm sure, yes, I can absolutely understand. In fact, I was just saying that NASA just tweeted, "We are saddened by the loss of Senator John Glenn, the first American to orbit Earth, a true American hero. Godspeed, John Glenn." And then they added Ad Astra, which is Latin, through hardship to the stars.
To the stars, to the stars. And I can't think of a more appropriate a send-off for John Glenn. Of course, I think over the next couple of days, you know, people are going to really be recalling some of these events, the history of it. It's interesting, Vlad, I was talking to my teenage daughter, and she wasn't really sure who John Glenn was. I think that that he is someone, and his role in history is something that I think all older Americans instantly remember and identify with, and perhaps the younger generation might need a little refresher course on just what a hero really is. But that's John Glenn.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, Bill, because although I was born right after Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in 1969. I, as we've spoken many times, admired all the astronauts, and it was through my love of Neil Armstrong that I got to know the Mercury 7 and how amazing they were, and of course John Glenn, and so I think, yeah, absolutely. It's important for us, certainly in these times right now, that we look to people like John Glenn and all of those pioneers, those initial pioneers. I'll just read off their names for our viewers so that if they are interested in learning more about John Glenn and the Mercury 7, obviously John Glenn, but also Scott Carpenter, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton, and Gordo Cooper. All amazing men, the very, very best that America had to offer. There they are at the very height of the Mercury 7 program. Our answer to what was becoming, at least early on, a Soviet domination of the race to space, into space and onto the moon. And it was these 7 men, these men that were plucked from the military, that had been test pilots, that we chose to lead the charge into space, and boy, did they ever.
Boy, did they ever is right. They certainly did. The Mercury 7, I think, when history books are written a couple of hundred years from now, they'll certainly be in there, and John Glenn will be at the top of that list.
And one of the things that I think gets lost now, Bill, is because it feels many, many times that the public, the American public, and perhaps even the rest of the world does not have the same fascination with space travel, with the pioneering of space, the way that that even I did as a kid growing up in the 70s. But how some of these programs, these very early programs, not just the Mercury programs, the Gemini missions, and the early Apollo missions, paved the way for doing what is happening right now, for example, in the International Space Station, or on the International Space Station.
Well, it is. And if you think of some of the research that John Glenn did on his shuttle flight back in 1998, it was all focused on medical research, because the long-range goal is to send humans out into the solar system, perhaps back to the moon and eventually onto Mars. And to make such long-duration trips possible, you've really got to know a lot about the effects of space flight and the rigors of weightlessness and the radiation environment to keep the astronauts healthy. A lot of the research that John Glenn participated in will certainly help keep astronauts safer. It shed light on a lot of processes that are going on there. It's certainly not the end of that story, but it's certainly a part of it. So even in the autumn of his life, he was contributing to this long-range goal of moving humans out of the solar system.
And Bill, when we talk about the race to space and the launch of the Mercury 7 program, what was the reaction? What was it like? And I know you probably weren't there, but what was it like when the Soviets first launched Sputnik 1 into orbit in 1957? Because the myths and the legends have been that it caught the United States flat-footed, and that's why we raced ahead and developed NASA and the Mercury 7 program. But were we really caught off guard by that?
Well, yes and no. America was proceeding, in 1958 was the International Geophysical Year, and America was proceeding toward building a small rocket to put a small satellite in orbit. But when the Russians put up Sputnik in 1957, it really shocked everybody, because all of a sudden the Soviets demonstrated that they had a rocket that could boost a satellite into orbit and by definition could carry a bomb. And so all of a sudden you had this Cold War adversary with a delivery system that you really couldn't defend against. It wasn't like seeing a bomber come over the horizon. I mean, if something's launched on a rocket, it's going to come right down and it could hit you. And so it created a lot of fear. And it was like, why do we have this so-called missile gap, as it was known at the time? I think it was mostly psychological. I don't think the Russians had really that big of a lead in hindsight, and it was certainly something we could catch up with rather quickly. But the impetus of Sputnik followed, just a few years later by putting a human being in orbit. Those were really major accomplishments, and they certainly were beyond what America was ready to do at that time. I mean, I don't think there was ever any question America could do it, and of course they ended up doing it. But the Russians, I think, at least in the public's perception, caught the nation flat-footed. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and I think it was a very scary thing.
Right.
The fact that all of a sudden your adversary had these big rockets that could, not only launching astronauts in capsules, but you could obviously put a bomb on top. And so I think that fear was real. It really was a Cold War space race, and there was a big drive in this country to catch up as fast as possible.
And catch up we did, as we've been talking, Bill. In April of 1961, the Russians put Yuri Gagarin into space, and right after that, in May 1961, we sent Alan Shepard into space, but his flight was only a suborbital flight, which is, and whereas Gagarin actually orbited the Earth. That's why John Glenn's mission in February of 1962 was so crucial.
Absolutely. Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom were a little up and down. They called them ballistic suborbital flights. They literally went up in space, had a few minutes of weightlessness, and came down. It did not compare to putting somebody in orbit. It just didn't compare to the achievement the Russians had with Yuri Gagarin. And so that's why John Glenn's flight was so important. It showed the country that, yes, we can compete on the high frontier. And, of course, as we all know now, within a few years, we had surpassed the Russians and went on to the moon within less than 10 years, landed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. So, hindsight's one of those things where, yeah, of course, it was obvious we were always going to win that race. The Americans were, but it sure wasn't obvious at the time. And John Glenn went a long way toward making people feel a lot better about themselves.
Bill Harwood, we thank you so much for your insights, your analysis, and clearly, just like the rest of us, enamored by this American hero. If you're just joining us, the breaking news, an American hero, aviation icon, former United States Senator, astronaut, John Glenn, dead at 95. We've just seen tweets that are coming in from everywhere, but significantly, I want to share with you the tweet from NASA. We are saddened by the loss of John Glenn, the first American to orbit Earth, a true American hero. Godspeed, John Glenn, ad Astra.